Though Thomas is famous for saying that regarding God, we do not really know what he is, but only what he is not, that statement only tells part of the story. For along with theological language under the rubric of the via negativa, think infinity, immutability, eternity, etc., Aquinas employs terminology under the rubric of both the via positiva, the positive way, and the via eminentiae, the way of eminence. He affirms, for instance, that God is good, perfect, omniscient, and omnipotent. A term that Thomas applies to God and that hovers, as it were, on the border between the negative way and the positive way is simple. By this word, he signals that essence and existence coincide in God. This means, on the one hand, that God cannot be defined or known categorically, hence the term is a function of the via negativa. On the other hand, the same term implies that God is the fullness of what it means to be. Hence, the use of the word is an expression of the via eminentiae. To make this clearer, we must recall that in Thomistic ontology, essence or quidditas, that's his term, is a principle of potency vis-a-vis existence or esse, to be, which is an active principle. Thus, for example, a human being is the actus essendi, the act of existence, delimited by the quidditas of humanity, existence actualizing, as it were, the potentiality that lies within it. We grasp this merely potential nature of humanity when we understand that there's no difference in content between humanitas in an actually existing human being and humanitas subsisting simply as a notion within consciousness. Thomas articulates the idea of the real distinction between essence and existence more generally in his early work, De Ente et Essentia. Here's a quote from Aquinas. Every essence or quiddity can be understood without understanding anything about its existence. I can understand what a human being is or what a phoenix is, and nevertheless not know whether either has existence in reality, close quote. So with this fundamental demarcation in mind between essence and existence, Thomas, in that same early text, mounts an elegant argument for God's existence, more convincing, I've always thought, than any of the famous five at the beginning of the Summa Theologiae. Whatever a thing has must come to it, he says, either from its proper nature, that is, as an essential property, or from an extrinsic cause. Hence, to use his famous example, risibility, the capacity for humor, pertains to a human being by nature, whereas light obtains in the atmosphere only through the ongoing influence of the sun. But with anything marked by a real distinction between essence and existence, its act of to be cannot belong to it properly. It must therefore receive this act of being through an extrinsic efficient cause. I'm quoting again from Thomas. And since everything that is through another is reduced to that which is through itself as to a first cause, there must be something that is the cause of existence in all things, in that this thing is existence only. His term, ipsa est esse tantum. It's the sheer act of to be. If we might put this in a pithy formula, that which merely has being, anything we experience in the world, is reduced finally to that which is being, that whose very nature is to be. The conclusion of the demonstration is that there's a reality in which essence and existence coincide, or better, something that's utterly unmarked by even a trace of potentiality. Hence Thomas's famous description of God as actus purus. Now, what should be clear is that this ultimate metaphysical ground cannot be construed as one existent among many, not a type of being at all. As Thomas states, I think startlingly enough in the Summa Theologiae, this reality is not in any genus, even the genus of being. And this is why, throughout his career, Thomas prefers the term ipsum esse subsistens, the subsisting act of being itself for God, rather than en summum, highest being, which would designate the most impressive item in the set of all beings. Here, Thomas's theological language is congruent with St. Anselm's description of God as id quo maius cogitari nequit, that than which nothing greater can be thought. For the reality signified by that descriptor, could not simply be the highest being, since the highest being plus any other being would be greater than the highest being alone. With respect to Anselm's description, God plus the entire world is not greater than God alone. My former professor, Robert Sokolowski, expressed the same idea as follows, quote, "After creation, there are indeed more beings, but not more perfection of esse," close quote. Now, lest we think that this is a purely philosophical speculation, we must recall that Thomas consistently correlates this manner of speaking of God with the self-revelation of God offered in the book of Exodus. When Moses inquires of God his name, he's asking a commonsensical question. Which God are you? He's endeavoring, reasonably enough, to put this mysterious speaker into some set of categories. The famous divine answer, "I am who I am," is designed to undermine the legitimacy of the question when posed in regard to God. Thomas parses the response in terms of the essence-existence metaphysics. God's essence, what he is, simply is his existence. In David Burrell's language, to be God is to be to be. Now, following from that, a creation metaphysics. From these high theological claims regarding the nature of God, a number of conclusions can be drawn with respect to the created order. As we've seen, that in which there is a real distinction between essence and existence must depend in the most radical sense upon the causal influence of ipsum esse. It is not the case that creation is a relation that obtains between a supreme existent, God, and more mitigated forms of existence. God and created things do not relate to each other in the standard Aristotelian sense, whereby a relation mediates between two or more things. Indeed, Thomas goes so far as to say in the De Potentia that a creature is, here's his Latin, quaedam relatio ad creatorem cum novitate essendi, a kind of relationship to the Creator with newness of being, so that the creature is a relationship to God all the way down. This implies, furthermore, that God is in all things, as Thomas puts it in the second Summa, quote, by essence, presence, and power. And then he adds, intime, most intimately so. Not an event sequestered at the beginning of time, creation is indeed continual. Creatio continua, Aquinas says. God sustaining the universe moment to moment. As the contemporary Thomist Herbert McCabe, I think, beautifully puts it, quote, not just like a sculptor who makes a statue and then leaves it alone, but rather like a singer who keeps her song in existence at all times. Though, as we will argue anon, God is certainly other than his creation, he is, as Catherine Tanner has it, otherly other, which is to say, non-contrastively or non-competitively other. In accord with his analogical conception of being, Thomas would never hold that God and creatures can be compared or contrasted in the ordinary sense of those terms. Neither, this is very important for politics, I think, neither do they jostle with one another for dominance on the same ontological grid. Instead, God, the true God, can come intimately close to a creature without compromising its integrity. We might see the episode of the burning bush in the book of Exodus, in which God's proximity makes the bush beautiful and radiant without consuming it, as an evocative anticipation of the incarnation, in which two natures, divine and human, come together, as the Council of Chalcedon put it, without mixing, mingling, or confusion, and utterly to the advantage of the human nature so united. Now, this language might easily lead one to conclude that Aquinas is a near pantheist, but this must be resisted. For he insists as clearly on the distinction between God and the world as he does on the proximity of God to the world. There can indeed be no real comparison between that which exists through the power of its own essence, and that which derives its being entirely from another. Between creator and creatures, there yawns indeed an infinite existential divide. Though God's otherness is non-contrastive, it remains total. Actus purus could never be confused or commingled with beings marked by potentiality. A very positive implication of this aspect of his teaching is that the created realm has its own relative independence. By the very act of creation, God opens up a space that is proper to the finite order, allowing it its own integrity. Thus, we can speak, for example, of the causal relationships and ontological principles that obtain within the material and political orders without making constant reference to the first cause. This is once again precisely because that cause is not one being among many, competing within the nexus of contingent causes and agents. The highly paradoxical claim that we've been exploring, that God is, as St. Augustine put it, simultaneously intimior intimo meo et superior sumo meo, closer to me than I am to myself, and infinitely beyond who I am. This carries unavoidably the implication that God has loved the universe into existence. Now, why? Well, according to Thomas's well-known formula, to love is to will the good of the other. If this is the case, then the cause that is fully actualized and that hence has no existential defect whatsoever can direct his will ad extra only in a completely unself-interested manner. He can only will the good of the other, since what is other to him can be of no possible advantage to him. This means that the very transcendence of God is what permits him to desire and make possible real human flourishing. Uneasy with the neo-Gnostic speculations of Hegel regarding the motivation for creation, the First Vatican Council taught that God gave rise to finitude not out of need, but rather to manifest his glory, which is coincident with the well-being of what he's made. St. Irenaeus put it famously, Gloria Dei homo vivent. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. We could say the glory of God is creation fully realized. Following the speculations of theologians in the school of radical orthodoxy, we might also observe that God's act of creation must be understood as peaceful and non-violent. In so many of the myths that have come to us from the ancient world, the act of creation is construed as a violent conquest, one god or set of gods defeating others. Typically in these accounts, the elements within the universe are interpreted as the severed and scattered body parts of the defeated deities. And we could even read the more rational accounts of the beginning of the world offered by the classical philosophers as refined versions of these primal myths. Thus, Plato's Demiurgos, surveying the forms, intrusively shapes matter, and Aristotle's prime mover similarly molds prime matter by means of irresistible attraction. But Ipsum Esse, and this is the point, Ipsum Esse, who brings every aspect of finitude into being ex nihilo, cannot even in principle intervene or interfere aggressively, manipulating something in the act of creation. Rather, it takes place non-violently. On the biblical telling, not through an act of conquest. Genesis is distinctive there, but rather through a non-violent act of speech. And if we might move from the metaphor of speech to that of music making, as we saw Herbert Mackay do, we come close to the musings of Augustine in his great, often overlooked treatise, De Musica, on music. In that remarkable text, the great African doctor maintains that every object, person, and event coming forth from the creative agency of God does so in the manner of a series of musical notes, each one of which endures only for a moment before giving way to the next. Since every creature comes into being ex nihilo, it contains within itself a tendency toward non-being. And thus, inevitably fades away so as to permit the next ontological note to be sounded. Augustine's overall point is that this melodic and symphonic play takes place under the direction ultimately of the Creator God. And if we shift back to a more spatial metaphor, we see that all creatures, from the largest and most complex to the simplest and smallest, are related to each other precisely because they share a common center in God. Though there are differences among them, to be sure, they are differentiated at a relatively superficial level. For in the final analysis, individual creatures are like islands in an archipelago, separate at the surface but joined at the depths. St. Francis's ecstatic evocation of brother sun and sister moon is not just inspired poetry, but rather exact metaphysics. For even things in the inanimate order are ontological siblings to human beings. Though both spatial and musical metaphors are illuminating, they miss a key element in Thomas's understanding of the relationship between God and the world. Though God has indeed made the world good, even very good, he's not made it perfect. Instead, it appears to be his will that the good creation evolves toward ever greater perfection, precisely under the influence of the final causality of the prime mover. This happens involuntarily in the natural material order, and it happens through intelligent and consciously willed engagement at the spiritual level. We might speak here with John Polkinghorne of the free process that God permits within the natural world and the free will that he allows to operate in humans and angels. Though any number of alluring causes are involved in the process, the ultimate cause of the created realm's movement is the supreme value who is God. It's worth noting that Aquinas' account of creation in its various dimensions involves both a Platonic and an Aristotelian sense of the good. You know, on Plato's reading, the good is that which gives itself, bonum difficivum sui, in the scholastic rendering of the principle. And on Aristotle's, the good is that which attracts by its perfection. For Thomas, God is good in both senses, seen under the rubric, respectively, of efficient and final causality. Moreover, lest we understand this in a vaguely deist way, we must recall Thomas's insistence that God's providence, quote, extends to particulars, close quote. In a word, God has not simply established the causal framework in which created things operate and evolve. He's intimately and personally implicated in each creaturely movement in his direction.